fans, and it's the most wonderful time. Oh, no. Well, not for me, and I'm sure much of you out there. Most of the teams I like were nowhere near the big game this year, and sadly with the way the conference championships ended, kind of made making this video a little less logical, but would have made more sense had they gone the other way. But screw it, I'm going to do it anyway. So, let me set the tone. The date, January 24th, 1982. The site, the Pontiac Silverdome, Detroit, Michigan. The event, Super Bowl XVI. The teams, the San Francisco 49ers and the Cincinnati Bengals. Had you said 1 year prior during Super Bowl 15 that you predicted that these two teams would be in the big game, you had likely been slapped silly and been called the son of a motherless goat. But let's take a look at what led up to this big, unlikely showdown. The San Francisco 49ers. They have not won a major championship before since the inception of the Super Bowl in 1966. They looked as if they were going to be a prominent contender winning the NFC West in 1970, 71, and 72. And they were coached by Dick Nolan, who had a great success as a defensive coordinator in Dallas. Back then, they were bolstered by star QB and veteran John Brodie, who at 35 years old won League MVP in 1970. His favorite target was wide receiver Gene Washington, who was a Pro Bowler. They had a good offensive line led by the likes of Len Rude. And on the defensive side of things, they had Hall of Famer linebacker Dave Wilcox and another Hall of Fame defensive back Jimmy Johnson. No, not that Jimmy Johnson. They lost back-to-back NFC Championship games against the Dallas Cowboys and lost them in the divisional round in 1972. Then in 1973, things went to hell. Luis Medalla, who had been running the club since 1952, was starting to make decisions that didn't bode very well for them. In 1973, they drafted Mike Holmes from Texas Southern. He would only play 2 seasons in San Francisco and didn't make much of an impact anywhere until he departed for the CFL a few years later. They missed out on Pro Bowl defensive back J.T. Thomas, taken 6 picks later. They did take fan favorite linebacker Willie Harper in the second round. They finished 5-9-0. Their offense was ranked 14th, their defense was ranked 19th, and this is out of 26 teams at the time. A huge letdown, and Brodie would retire at the end of the year after 17 seasons. Steve Spurrier was expected to take over the reins at quarterback. 1974, it got worse, and they had 2 first-round selections, back-to-back no less. They need some strong running, so they drafted Wilbur Jackson, and he'd have 3 seasons of 700-plus yards in San Fran, but was gone after 1979 to Washington. Right after they took defensive lineman Bill Sandifer, who lasted 5 NFL seasons and only 3 in San Francisco. They could have taken a guy by the name of Lynn Swann to strengthen their receiving core, but no. He's only a Hall of Famer with 4 Super Bowl rings, but anyway. For the second straight year, their second-round pick ended up being a steal. Offensive tackle Keith Van Horst. They finished 6-8-0. Their defense improved drastically, finishing 11th. Their offense fell to 19th. Spurrier suffered numerous injuries and only played 3 games. Neither Joe Reed or rookie Tom Owen could muster up anything, despite a good rookie season from Jackson in the backfield. It was the last season for 4-time Pro Bowl offensive center Forrest Blue, who spent the rest of his career in Baltimore. But the biggest loss would be Wilcox at linebacker, who retired at the end of the season. It was about to get worse. In 1975, they were looking for a defensive tackle in the draft, but being bad, yet not the worst, only meant they were unable to obtain Randy White or Gary Johnson. They had to settle for Jimmy Webb, and I'm sure they would have been better off with the guy who wrote all those top 40 hits, rather than this Jimmy Webb, who did indeed play 6 seasons, but really nothing of note happened in his career. The draft as a whole was abysmal for San Fran. They also could have used a tight end and passed up on Russ Francis. They finished 5-9-0, and their only Pro Bowler was defensive lineman Cedric Hardman. Spurrier played 11 games but couldn't stay healthy. The QB situation was a mess. The Niners needed one badly. Also, after 8 seasons, Coach Dick Nolan was fired. The offense was still weak at 16th, and the defense fell to 14th. The Niners, however, hired Monty Clark, who was on staff with the Dolphins and had 2 Super Bowl rings to show for it. And this was his first head coaching job. They also made a big acquisition, acquiring former Heisman Trophy winner Jim Plunkett at quarterback. Plunkett put up some decent numbers, but he wasn't really panning out to the hype that he had as a former Heisman Trophy winner. And, he had some decent days in New England, but nothing that stood out. As Spurrier went to the expansion Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Niners had no draft picks in the first round, but made a steal of a deal again in the second with center Randy Cross. The Niners under Clark made a drastic improvement at 8-6-0, but sadly still missed the playoffs. But at least this gave the fans and the organization hope. Their offense was still struggling somewhat, but they had a decent running game with Jackson, as well as Pro Bowler Delvin Williams. Their defense, however, was 3rd best in the league, thanks in large part to that incredible defensive line of veteran Tommy Hart, as well as Hardman and Cleveland Elam. By God, the suffering was about to come to an end. Yes, wait. The Niners have new ownership going into the next season. The DiBartolo family and the principal owner, Edward J. DiBartolo Jr., and yes, I know some of you are already thinking, this is good for the Niners. Well, you'd be right about that, but bear with me, it didn't really start out that way. But it's not so good for head coach Monty Clark. GM Lou Spadaya retired after 24 seasons running this club, so a new GM was needed. Enter Joe Thomas, who Clark had major issues with during his time in Miami, as Thomas used to be the team's director of player personnel and felt that Thomas would disrupt the Niners club significantly, and he was even offered money, that being Clark that is, to relinquish his player personnel role, and was also offered a huge extension as a coach. Clark refused and was fired. They brought in Ken Meyer to coach the team. He had been with the Niners as an assistant briefly in 1968, spent 4 years with the Jets and the last couple with the Rams. This would be his first head coaching job. And yes, 1977 was no better. Spending all they did to acquire Plunkett was coming back to bite them in the ass, as they had no first-round draft pick, no second-round draft pick. Spadaya left this team in disarray before he left, and the trade was useless. Plunkett was not panning out whatsoever. The team finished 5-9-0. Meyer was done after one season, but that's not all. The Plunkett experiment, all they sacrificed, was over. He was gone after this season and went to the Raiders. Delvin Williams is also gone after this season. Also, four-time Pro Bowl wide receiver Gene Washington. See you later. Same goes for star defensive end Tommy Hart. And sadly, in the offseason, Pro Bowl punter Tom Whittam suffered a car accident that ended his career. And Joe Thomas, GM of the year. But wait, he traded Williams for their first and fifth round draft pick. That'd be cool, right? Right. Well, I mean, they went from having no picks in the last two first rounds of the draft to having two this year. Ken McAfee was the 7th overall pick, a tight end out of Notre Dame, and played all of 2 seasons. The next tight end, picked on that draft was Hall of Famer Ozzie Newsome. Linebacker Dan Buns was the pick they obtained from Miami, from Long Beach State, and was 24th overall, but this would actually be a really good pick for the Niners. You'll see much later. This team, though, they sucked. New coach Pete McCulley only lasted 9 games. Fred O'Connor didn't fare much better in the remaining 7. Thomas was not getting it done in the front office, and the offense was abysmal, and new QB Steve DeBerg, a star at San Jose State, had nothing going for him. Thomas also wasted a ton of money on a now injury-prone past his prime, O.J. Simpson. Thomas had tanked this team, and much to the delight of Niners fans everywhere, Joe Thomas was fired as general manager, but now they had to damage to repair that looked like it could take maybe years, decades, who knows. And the man that DiBartolo felt could do it was Bill Walsh. Walsh was coming off a 2-year stint at Stanford. He had NFL coaching experience, but this would be his first head coaching job, and he's taking it all on becoming the general manager. At the NFL draft in 1979, oh look, thanks to Genius Joe, well, Walsh goes into his first draft without a first-round pick, which was traded to Buffalo for O.J. This would have been first overall, by the way, for the Niners. The only saving grace that the Bills wasted it on Tom Cousineau. Sadly, the second-round pick was squandered on running back James Owens, who on paper looked fine. He was a former Olympian and track and field star, and played all 2 seasons on the Niners. His career never panned out. But then in the 3rd round, well, they selected a quarterback at Notre Dame by the name of Joe Montana, 82nd overall. Montana climbed his way to be a starter at Notre Dame, and in his 4th year, he was the main guy. After injuries and not able to attain that starting spot had held him back. The team, however, went on a tear and went on a historic run to win the national championship, upsetting the Texas Longhorns, led by phenom running back Earl Campbell. And then played in the Cotton Bowl a year later and led the Irish to a thrilling 35-34 win over Houston, eating a bowl of chicken soup to heal his flu symptoms and erasing a 34-12 deficit in the 4th quarter, one of the greatest college comebacks ever. But he failed to impress scouts at the Combine with his, quote, lack of arm strength, but Walsh knew the team needed a QB, and a strategic one at that, and Montana was the best guy for that by the 3rd round. Gee, wonder how this will pan out. Also, by the 10th round, oh, look at this, the receiver out of Clemson looks pretty good. Let's see how he does. Oh, his name is Dwight Clark. 6'4", over 200 pounds, can play tight end or wideout, has a great reach with his hand, can make difficult catches. Anyway, he averages over 18 yards a catch and can gain significant yardage, but 10th round, nothing really comes out of those picks, right? And 1979, however, was not a good year for the Niners. They again finished 2-14. Some were already calling for Walsh's head, but the offense did improve to 16th, and DeBerg was still the starter. Montana only threw 23 passes all year. And while DeBerg had improved, many still weren't sold on him. The ground game had improved, however, as Paul Hofer put up some good numbers, and so did OJ, to be fair, and Wilbur Jackson. But the Juice retired after the season, and he just couldn't stay healthy. Their defense was still an abysmal 27th, second to last. Though some bright spots joined the team. Dwayne Board was cut by the Steelers, and he was a rookie defensive lineman who might do them some good. And defensive back Dwight Hicks joins the team after a year in the CFL, playing for the Toronto Argonauts after the Detroit Lions, who had his NFL rights, gave them up. 7 years, no playoffs. The decade started so well for this club, but now they become almost as big a laughingstock as the New York Giants at this point. The Cincinnati Bengals history was not as long as San Fran. As a matter of fact, their history merely began as one of the last teams to join the AFL, and they spent 2 seasons there before the merger. And their first year in the NFL, they actually made the playoffs. And things would change forever in 1971, when they drafted Ken Anderson, a QB out of Augustana. Overlooked by everyone, he'd become the face of the franchise. The team was poised to become one of the best in the league. Paul Brown, since their inception, has been the owner, the GM, and their coach. They had a promising running back in Boobie Clark. On the receiving corps, they had first-round pick Isaac Curtis, Charlie Joyner, and Pro Bowler Chip Myers. Also Pro Bowler tight end Bob Trumpy. A well-rounded offensive line led by center Bob Johnson. On defense, they had defensive lineman and Pro Bowler Mike Reed, linebacker Jim LeClaire, and a very talented group of defensive backs Tommy Casanova, Ken Riley, and Lamar Parrish. Unlike the Niners, 1973 was actually very kind to the Bengals. Their first-round draft pick was wide receiver out of San Diego State, Isaac Curtis. They finished 10-4-0, first in the AFC Central. However, the Dolphins' dominance of the AFC back then was very well documented, and the Bengals sadly didn't stand a chance against them. Their offense and defense was solid, and they had 3 Pro Bowlers, Curtis, Reed, and Trumpy. However, after the season was over, they'd lose Tom DeLeon as center, who would go on to have a great career in Cleveland. This began a trend where the Bengals would underestimate the value of some of their players, and they'd go on to be stars elsewhere. And also middle linebacker Bill Berge would also play his last season as a Bengal this year, and would go on to the Eagles and garner 4 Pro Bowl selections. 1974 didn't go as well, however. Their draft pick of the first round, Bill Kohler, did not have a great career, but he has since gone on to have success in coaching. The Bengals also slipped to 7-7 despite their rankings in offense and defense not drastically changing, but this means they missed the playoffs. However, Ken Anderson leads the NFL in passing yardage. Also, defensive tackle, former Pro Bowler Mike Reed is forced to retire due to injuries, and actually became a country singer and had a few hits on the country chart. Also, offensive tackle Stan Walters, who'd only become a starter this past season, is sent to Philadelphia in the offseason and has a tremendous career there. 1975, however, saw a positive and drastic change for the team. In the draft in the first round, their pick was Florida linebacker Glenn Cameron, and while he may not have been a Hall of Famer, he'd be a decent pick for the Bengals going forward as he became a great role player for the club. Their 5th round pick, however, Pat McNally, a new punter, would actually be a huge steal for them. The Bengals were on a tear, finishing 11-3-0, which, oddly enough, was still only good enough for second in the AFC Central, of course the Steelers being first. Ken Anderson for the second straight year led the NFL in passing yards and led in passer rating. And while their running game wasn't as solid as most, their offense was ranked 9th. Their defense made a drastic improvement, being ranked 6th, thanks in large part to that tremendous defensive backcourt, as Lamar Parrish made it to the Pro Bowl, while Ken Riley, who was a second-team All-Pro that year. In the playoffs, however, it was again a disappointing finish. The Bengals lost 31-28 to the Raiders despite coming back being down 31-14. The comeback bid, however, fell short. Also, the man who has been steering the ship from all ports, Paul Brown, at the end of the season, stepped away from his coaching duties to focus on management. The Bengals also made a trade in the offseason with the San Diego Chargers, parting with receiver Charlie Joyner, who is coming off a career-high 726-yard season, for defensive lineman Coy Bacon. Cool name. This didn't even make much sense at the time, let alone hindsight. Well, yeah, okay, Joyner is a Hall of Famer who'd play 11 seasons in San Diego. Bacon, to be fair, was no slouch. He was a Pro Bowler a few years prior to this during a tenure with the Rams. It should also be noted that along with Joyner, they lost someone else to the Chargers. Assistant coach, Bill Walsh. Yes, the very same. He became San Diego's offensive coordinator, as he was also considered for the head coaching job for the Bengals. He didn't get it. Oh boy. Bill Johnson was named head coach for the 1976 season, as he had been with the Bengals since their inception and had been their offensive line coach. And this 1976 draft should be a dandy for the Bengals. They had 24 total picks. Pretty much the opposite of San Fran around this time, but Paul Brown didn't do so well here for the most part. They had 2 first-round picks, and first 11th overall, they took wide receiver Billy Brooks out of Oklahoma. His career did not pan out. All the while, some guy named Steve Largent was passed up by every team until the 4th round. Even second-rounder Sammy White of the Vikings, who had a pretty good career, would have been a better choice. The next pick was Archie Griffin, a running back out of Ohio State. He did have an upside to him and would have a so-so career. They took guard Glenn Boozhonk and kicker Chris Barr in the 5th round, and those were solid picks. And Griffin had a good rookie season, however, with 625 yards on the ground, and the Bengals finished with an impressive 10-4-0. And their offense and defense were both ranked in the top 10, the latter of which thanks again to that talented secondary. And hey, Coy Bacon led the NFL in unofficial sacks at 21.5. Former Pro Bowl wide receiver Chip Myers, however, retired at the end of the year. And despite all this, the Bengals missed the playoffs! Oh no. The next year, things didn't get better, but they did pretty good in the draft as they had 3 first-round draft picks. The first one, defensive end Eddie Edwards out of Miami. Yes, this would be a good pick for the Bengals, as he would strengthen their defensive line. And Wilson Whitley, another defensive lineman who would be a good role player for the team. However, tight end Mike Cobb out of Michigan didn't pan out at all. In the 2nd round, running back Pete Johnson was selected. And in the 5th round, defensive back Louis Breeden was also taken, and so Paul Brown and his scouting team were on their game this year. The Bengals were not, however. They slipped to 8-6-0 and missed the playoffs for the 2nd straight year. The offense had slipped all the way down from 6th to 14th, while Anderson was still putting up some decent numbers in the air. The running backs were struggling, and the defense was still strong at 7. Despite this, not all hope was lost, but Pro Bowl tight end Bob Trumpy and defensive back Tommy Casanova retired at the end of the season. Also, Coy Bacon, who they gave up Charlie Joyner for, was already off to Washington. And even worse, so was Lamar Parrish. The team was not making good moves, and Paul Brown was taking flack by the media, and rightfully so. And speaking of 1978, it wasn't good. They did have the most draft picks again that year, and again had 2 first-round draft picks. 8th overall, they took Ross Browner, a defensive end from Notre Dame. He became a big part of the team. Also, Blair Bush at center as depth to the team's offensive line. They, however, fell to 4-12-0, and head coach Bill Johnson was fired. After an 0-5 start, they hired Homer Rice. The defense was still decent despite some of the losses, but the offense sputtered and went completely downhill. Anderson throwing costly interceptions, while the running game was not strong. Despite the decent draft picks, many questions Brown's direction where he's taking this team. Other players on the team, they had parted with, are having success elsewhere. In 1979, the rebuilding phase continued. They took Jack Thompson at QB in the 1st round. The team was losing faith in Anderson, even though he was still their guy, technically. But we're hoping to groom and prepare Thompson, easy for me to say, to be their next guy. Yet they passed up on Phil Simms. They also drafted running back Charles Alexander, as they again had 2 picks in the 1st round. Tight end Dan Ross was taken in the 2nd round. Offensive guard Max Montoya was taken in the 7th round. The Bengals were still making steals of picks in this draft, but they were passing up a lot of big names in the 1st round. The Bengals' ground game improved, and their passing game, however, got weaker as faith in Anderson was at an all-time low. The receiving corps outside of Don Bass, however, wasn't the strongest. Former 2nd round pick Pete Johnson had a banner year with over 800 yards rushing, while Archie Griffin actually had a career best 688. But their defense had slipped to dead last. Things were just a mess in Cincy. Head coach Homer Rice was fired at the end of the season. Paul Brown was going to make a splash, and soon, he couldn't fire himself. But if he wants his team to be a success, something needs to be done going into the 1980s. Going into 1980, it was a tale of 2 teams. The Niners seemed utterly hopeless, and since 1973 had become a very futile franchise with terrible decisions, inept management, directionless coaches, and no hope, as Bill Walsh had very little faith from the media or the fans for that matter. As for the Bengals, they looked to be the team of the future at one point. Paul Brown, on the other hand, has made some really good decisions as well, some really questionable ones, with sadly the latter winning out. While they haven't made the playoffs since 1975, they at least had 2 winning records after that, and while there wasn't much hope for this team either, it seemed they had a better chance of the future than the Niners, as they would hire a new coach. Forrest Gregg, Hall of Fame offensive lineman, 2-time Super Bowl winner from the Green Bay Packers, just coming off a 1-year stint coaching the CFL's Toronto Argonauts. So came draft day. On April 29, 1980, it's actually the first draft to be televised in NFL history. Believe it or not, it wasn't seen as a big deal for a TV event. It only drew a so-so audience. The Bengals had the 3rd overall pick in the draft, and as their history has shown, they made some good but not great picks at times, and Not any real game changers for the most part. A lot of the Niners picks, what little they had, were a few gems, but again, nowhere near enough to turn this team around. It seemed the Bengals at least had a plan, whereas San Fran was up a creek without a paddle, or a boat for that matter. The Bengals had the 3rd overall pick. The Niners had 2 picks at 13th and 20th overall. The Bengals shocked some, but not too many, as it was suspected they would take offensive line and tackle Anthony Munoz out of the University of South Carolina. The Niners took fullback Harold Cooper out of Rice and Jim Stuckey from Clemson, as the team was losing Pro Bowl defensive tackle Cedric Hardman to the Raiders. Also, the Niners made a nice pick in the 2nd round, drafting Purdue's Keena Turner at linebacker. Munoz was questioned, however, due to certain knee issues, and the analysis, somewhat all over the place. Some praised Brown for picking such a great prospect. Others felt he should have gone with more defensive depth due to being ranked dead last in 1979. But they knew Anderson could still put up some numbers and perhaps just needed a better offensive line to give him time, and also to help add to a growing running game. Munoz also has a national championship ring to his credit, and at 6'6" and over 270 pounds, he was an imposing presence. He protected on offense better than just about anyone. So, how would these two rebuilding clubs fare in 1980? Well, the Niners did bounce back somewhat by tripling their win total from each of the last 2 seasons, finishing 6-10. Still not good, but certainly not abysmal. But the QB issues were still one that weren't solved by season's end. On one hand, Steve DeBerg had more yards, and the Niners started out with 3-0 with him as their starter. But he faltered and would only win one more game, finishing 4-5 in that regard. Montana had done a better job with a ratio of touchdowns and interceptions with 15-9 compared to DeBerg's dubious 12-17. Completion percentage, Montana was an excellent 64.5 and led the entire NFL in that category, compared to DeBerg's 57.9, which was actually nothing to sneeze at. Also, Montana's 87.8 passer rating was 5th best in the league, whereas DeBerg's 66.7 was nothing really to look at. Also, something that stood out was Montana's 2-5 record as a starter, and that's what many were pointing at. The Niners had a very potent offense that would continue to improve, as Dwight Clark was just 9 yards short of 1,000, while rookie first-rounder Earl Cooper shined with over 1,200 yards from scrimmage that included 700 on the ground. Also, despite improving in many areas, this didn't give the Niners fans much hope. Many still felt Montana wasn't going to be an elite quarterback despite his numbers. The Niners' offensive line, they gave up the 7th least sacks in the league, thanks to Quillen, Farnhurst, Cross, and Ayers. Also, 2-time Pro Bowler Charlie Young, in his first year with the Niners, helped a great deal. As for the Bengals, they finished 6-10 as well. The offense had really fallen off the rails, 2nd worst in the league. Ken Anderson did not have a stellar year with 1,770 yards passing, the 2nd worst mark of his career, only compared to his rookie year where he wasn't even a starter. He did have a very good 60.4% completion rate, but only 6 touchdowns to 13 interceptions, and facing all but 100% completely lost in him now. Some were calling for first-round pick Jack Thompson to finally take the reins. Despite this, the Bengals did have a strong ground game, with over 700 yards each from Pete Johnson and Charles Alexander. The defense, however, was a better story, finishing 14th, middle of the league, as Louis Breeden had 7 picks, while Eddie Edwards, a former first-round pick, had 12 sacks. Neither team had a Pro Bowl selection, and now the Niners have missed the playoffs for 8 straight seasons. The Bengals have for 5. And to rub salt in the wound, former players from both teams played in Super Bowl 15 that season. The champion Oakland Raiders and runner-up Eagles. 3 former Niners and 3 former Bengals were playing in the big game. The NFC champion Eagles had former Bengals star linebacker Bill Bergey and offensive lineman Stan Walters, as well as former Niners offensive lineman Woody Peoples. The Raiders, however, winning the big game, rubbed salt in the wounds of both teams, as the Bengals' former kicker Chris Barr, who'd only joined the Raiders that year, got himself a ring. Former Niners Cedric Hardman, who also joined them just that year, got his own. But the biggest shot in the to them all had to be Jim Plunkett, who was already being deemed as one of the biggest draft busts in NFL history, was a bench warmer for 2 years before Vince Pastorini got hurt, and he came in, led to many victories, and led them to be the first wildcard team to win the Super Bowl, and was the game's MVP. And yes, we all know he didn't fare too well in his 2 seasons as a Niner, and they gave up a lot for him, including many draft picks. Oh, but the Bengals' former receiver Charlie Joyner, who they gave up for a guy that would only last 2 seasons, is still killing it in San Diego. With the most dangerous receiving corps in the league, he had 1,180 yards receiving, made his 3rd Pro Bowl appearance, and was a first-team All-Pro in 1980. Also, the Chargers barely lost the AFC Championship to the Raiders. These two teams, they say, did it to themselves. Many of their former players finding success elsewhere, and at the day of Super Bowl 15, there was no way these two teams would be in the conversation for the 1981 season. Right? Well, it all begins with the 1981 draft. What is next for these two rebuilding clubs? A lot of major prospects in this draft class, so both the Bengals and 49ers have a lot to choose from, especially on defense this year, which seems to be the name of the game for this draft. Which is something the Niners desperately need at this point themselves, but the offensive weapons are there too, and the Bengals could use some strength on their receiving core. Having identical records likely means they'll be picking close together in the draft, and you'd be right. The Niners had the 8th overall pick, the Bengals had the 10th. And while this draft class was something, the top 5 alone features 2 Hall of Famers and 3 others who had great careers and were Pro Bowlers. At number 8, the Niners went with Ronnie Lott, a defensive back out of USC, and former teammate of Bengals' big pick from last year, Anthony Munoz. 2 picks later, the Bengals picked up David Verser, a kick returner / wide receiver, and this pick confused a few. But first, let's look at Ronnie Lott from USC, who is being regarded as one of the best defensive backs in the country. Fast, hard-hitting, ready to read any pass pattern, can snag an interception with his quick hands, and he had 8 in his final year, where he was a consensus All-American. The Niners scored big here. As for the Bengals, their draft pick did shock many, and while yes, they needed a receiver, Verser was more known as, again, be better used as a kick returner, and he did have over 500 yards in his final year of receiving, but a lot of pundits just felt he wasn't the best in that scenario. Well, in the second round, the Bengals made up for it. Chris Collinsworth, out of the Florida Gators, was a second-round pick for the team and was definitely a guy that Bengals certainly needed, much more than Verser. With a tall reach and an ability to fool a given secondary, running precise patterns and quick hands, his near 600 yards gave him status as a first-team All-American, and 3 years in a row was first-team All-Southeastern Conference. He also averaged 15 yards a catch in his final year. The Niners, however, made a big steal of a deal to add depth to their linebacking core and veteran leadership, obtaining Jack Hacksaw Reynolds to the team, who spent 11 seasons with the Los Angeles Rams, was released without much fuss from the organization and anger from many Rams fans, however. He's one of the most popular players in the history of the club during his tenure there, and was coming off the second of 2 Pro Bowl seasons, and was a second-team All-Pro in 1979, the year the Rams made it all the way to the Super Bowl before jumping a loss to Pittsburgh. This was very well played on the part of Walsh. Going into 1981, the Niners decided Joe Montana was their guy, despite skeptics and experts saying he wasn't ready and he never will be to be an elite QB. Walsh clearly knew something the rest of the world didn't, and even many Niners fans were not sold on this. Steve DeBerg was off to Denver, and now all the eggs were in the basket of the unproven Joe Montana. The Bengals also made a move that was divided amongst the response. They were sticking with the man who has been their guy for nearly 10 years, Ken Anderson, who now at 32 was getting another chance. He had proven himself to be among the best more than once, and was still loved by Bengals fans for the most part, despite the team's struggle. However, they were definitely not all behind him, and Forrest Gregg had faith in the veteran to get them where they need to be. So here we go. What will 1981 hold for these rebuilding clubs? Their odds of winning the Super Bowl weren't exactly stellar either. France, plus 5,000, ranked them tied for 19th out of 28 teams with the best odds of winning. Cincy, not far behind, was plus 6,000 and was ranked 22nd out of 28. Let's see how this season would commence. In week 1, it didn't start out that great for the Niners. Montana only threw 10 incompletions, but wasn't able to make too many big plays and was sacked 4 times and did throw a costly pick in a 24-17 loss on the road to Detroit. As for the Bengals, quite the opposite. They erased a 21-0 deficit against the Seahawks. After the first quarter, their defense tightened up, and despite a poor outing from Anderson, Pete Johnson and the Bengals running game were on point, and Johnson had 84 yards on 20 carries and 2 touchdowns in a 27-21 win at home. The next week would see both clubs get one in the win column. Joe Montana bounced back huge, throwing for 287 yards and 3 touchdowns, while Freddie Solomon had 113 yards receiving and Dwight Clark had over 80 in a 28-17 win at home against the Bears. The Bengals scored another thrilling victory, only this time it was against the New York Jets on the road. And Anderson played a much better game, as for the second straight week, the defense started weak but came alive after falling behind early. This time they fell behind 17-3 en route to a 31-30 win. Anderson threw 22 completions and 2 touchdowns, as well as 252 yards, while Isaac Curtis had over 100 yards receiving. The next week was a disaster for the 49ers, a devastating 34-17 loss to the Falcons. Montana again threw only 10 incompletions, but threw two very costly picks among those, and the red-hot Falcons, their superstar QB Steve Bartkowski, schooled his counterpart. Now the Niners are 1-2 to start the season, and most people thought, oh, same old Niners. The Bengals would suffer their first loss, however, against hated division rivals like Cleveland Browns. It was a much closer game than the Niners had in their loss. This one was just a 2017 loss at home, however. In the last couple games, their ground game had been shut down. Anderson played decent with just 9 incompletions and a touchdown and no picks, but the Bengals got killed on time of possession, only had 15 first downs compared to the Browns' 31. The Bengals at 2-1-0 looked good, but far from great. And San Francisco, however, something unexpected happened. A 7-game winning streak. It began in a very defensive battle with the New Orleans Saints when the Niners put the game out of reach after Ronnie Lott, the rookie first-round draft pick, intercepted an Archie Manning pass and returned it 26 yards for a touchdown. His first interception was truly one to remember, and it put the game out of reach, 21-7, hanging on to win 21-14. The secondary continued to do damage when the Niners dominated the lowly Washington Redskins. They picked them off 4 times, 2 by Dwight Hicks, who returned 1 for a touchdown, another one by Lott, as well as Milt McColl, as they took the game on the road by a score of 30-17. And the Niners were starting to get some positive attempts, but the skeptics obviously were still ever present. But they shut up most people with this emphatic 45-14 win at home against NFL powerhouses, the Dallas Cowboys. Montana was fantastic. He threw for 269 yards, and his favorite target, Dwight Clark, had 135 of those, including a huge 78-yard play between the two. Also, the big free agent Hacksaw Reynolds was key in holding superstar running back Tony Dorsett to just 21 yards rushing. Suddenly, the NFL media was starting to take notice of the Niners as his victory changed the way they were looked at going forward. But faith in Montana still wavered. Not long before the Dallas win, however, the Niners made a trade. They traded second-round draft pick to state rivals San Diego Chargers for defensive lineman Fred Dean to strengthen their defensive line. Boy, the Chargers done messed up here. Fred Dean was coming off 2 straight Pro Bowl selections and was a first-team All-Pro the year prior. The Chargers were only concerned about building their offense, and after a contract dispute, they decided to make an example of the underpaid Dean, break up the chemistry he had with the likes of Gary Big Hands Johnson, trading him for a mere second-round draft pick. Yeah, that'll show him. Anyway, Dean brought down Packers QB Lynn Dickey a couple times in San Fran's 13-3 win over the Packers. Next up was a 2017 win over the Rams, where Montana and Clark were firing on all cylinders. The former had 287 yards passing, the latter had another 100-yard game. And the defense was on fire again as a secondary gave Terry Bradshaw a huge headache in a huge 17-14 win over the Steelers, as Bradshaw was picked off 3 times. A lot was different now in Atlanta. The Falcons, who were a Super Bowl favorite that started hot, were now struggling immensely. And the Niners won this one 17-14. And the Niners also picked off Bartkowski 3 times as Dwight Hicks stayed hot and had 2. Also, Clark stayed hot with 128 yards receiving. That's 7 in a row. Count them up! On both sides of the ball, the Niners had what it took, it seemed. And not many could believe it. Joe Montana was making magazine covers. Niners fans were seeing like they were finally fully behind him. Ronnie Lott was a rookie sensation. Dwight Hicks was having a great year. Fred Dean was a huge acquisition, and Dwight Clark was making big plays. And people were tipping their hat to Bill Walsh as the Niners sat at 8-2 atop the NFC West. They're dominating their division. They haven't reached as many wins since 1976. So let's go back to the Bengals, where we left off as they were 2-1-0. The flair for dramatic wins continued for the Bengals. They improved to 3-1 with a win over the Bills, a 27-24 overtime win. A back-and-forth battle where the Bengals again had to come back from this one 21-10. Anderson was great with 28 completions, 320 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And it was a bit of a breakout game for Chris Collinsworth. 10 catches, 111 yards, and a touchdown. The receiving corps was showing huge improvement, and it desperately needed it. However, the Houston Oilers defense shut the Bengals down. Their running game just to 75 yards. Anderson did complete 30 passes, but through 22 incompletions, he was forced to throw more. Earl Campbell, pretty much the Oilers, was single-handedly won this game for them on the offensive side of things anyway, with a 17-10 win. At this point, the Bengals looked middle of the road, but some say better than years recent. The Bengals, however, did not give their fans, well, much to anxiety this week because they won in a huge dominant win over the 41-19 win over the Colts. Anderson was shocking the world himself with his performances this season. Deemed as washed up and finished, and he needed to step aside for the next generation. He threw just 6 incompletions and 3 touchdowns in that win over Indianapolis, and Dan Ross had over 100 yards receiving as one of the most stagnant receiving corps in the league, was becoming one of the most dangerous. And how I said the Cowboys' victory changed how people were looking at San Francisco? Well, a 34-7 win over a team that has embarrassed them for years. Division rivals Pittsburgh Steelers were crushed by the Bengals, and this one definitely changed the media's perception of them. They destroyed the Steel Curtain with 510 yards of offense, as Anderson had 346 yards passing. Chris Collinsworth, Verser, Ross, and Crater all had over 50 yards receiving, as again, any weapon was dangerous for Anderson to go to, while Pete Johnson had 87 yards on the ground. The Bengals sat at 5-2. However, the Bengals were embarrassed by the lowly Saints in a 17-7 upset where they had less than half of the offensive yardage they had from the previous game over the Steelers with just 230. And however, this Bengals team seemed to be taking things a lot more serious than years past, but again, there were a lot of naysayers, and how do you shut them up, you ask? A big winning streak of their own, 5 in a row. First, they got some revenge on division rivals Houston with a 34-21 win, and Anderson threw just 9 incompletions and 3 touchdowns, while Pete Johnson had the biggest game of the year with 114 yards on 26 carries. And then came a monster 40-17 win over the San Diego Chargers. Anderson played another beauty. The night belonged to his receiver, Isaac Curtis, who had 8 catches for 147 yards, including a 68-yard touchdown. And also, rookie sensation Collinsworth had 4 catches for 97 yards. They also sacked Chargers superstar quarterback Dan Fouts, who had a great offensive line in front of him 6 times. Reggie Williams and Eddie Edwards each had 2 sacks. Louis Breeden had 2 interceptions, and one of them was returned 102 yards for a touchdown. It was the perfect game. And while the Cincinnati offense was shut down against the Rams, their defense was not. Breeden had another monster game with 2 more picks, giving him 4 in 2 games, and the Bengals take this one 24-10. Their good fortune continues, however, with a dominant 38-21 win over the Broncos. Anderson throws for nearly 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. His comeback story has started to make headlines. Johnson added 99 yards rushing, and Ken Riley was the dominant defensive back this week with 2 picks. Anderson just stayed hot against division rival Cleveland with a 41-21 win, only throwing 6 incompletions and 4 touchdowns. For Pete Johnson, another 100-yard game rushing and 2 touchdowns. The Bengals have shocked the NFL themselves. They're at 10-3, and MVP talks are abounding with Anderson, something that nobody thought they'd ever hear again. This is the first time they reached double digits in wins since 1976, when they actually missed the playoffs with a 10-4 record. But they were just 1 win and a Steelers loss away from clinching the playoffs. Where we last left the Niners was at Week 10, and they had just finished a 7-game winning streak. But that came to an end during a Week 11 loss to the Cleveland Browns, as the Bengals' luck against the Browns just didn't rub off on the Niners. Heartbreaking 15-12 loss thanks to a late field goal, whereas Joe Montana had a rough game with 18 incompletions and 2 picks and was also sacked 3 times. Freddie Solomon, however, was the big playmaker in a thrilling back-and-forth outing with the Rams. 33-31, the Niners took it thanks to a late field goal from Wei Wershing. And Solomon had 124 yards on 5 catches, averaging nearly 25 yards a catch. Ronnie Lott continued to make his case for Defensive Rookie of the Year with an interception return for a touchdown as well. And the Niners moved to 10-3 with a tight 17-10 win over the Giants. Montana is in command. Clark plays a biggie, but the day belongs to Carlton Williamson as the Niners secondary continues to shine. He snags 2 big interceptions, and also Hicks adds another to a banner year, and to make this win all the more sweeter. The San Francisco 49ers, for the first time since 1972, are heading to the playoffs and win their first division title since that year as well. That brings us to Week 14. And what do you know? These 2 teams are facing off in a big game in Week 14. The Niners have punched their ticket. The Bengals can do the same with a win here and a Steelers loss. The game was hyped up in the media as 2 of the NFL's biggest surprises squaring off. So there was anticipation from both fan bases as well as casual viewers. A packed house of rabid Bengals supporters were ready. The The first quarter, the Bengals had trouble moving the ball, however. As a matter of fact, both teams did for the most part, but Dwight Clark made a couple big catches, and that's all they needed for Bill Ring to catch a 4-yard pass from Montana, and the Niners lead 7-0 after 1. Pete Johnson started getting things going, however, for the Bengals. Some big running plays, following the blocks of star offensive lineman Anthony Munoz, who was having a great year, and eventually set up a Jim Breach field goal, and it made it 7-3. But the mistakes kept coming, and Anderson was playing brutally, throwing costly picks. It was probably the worst game of the year he played so far since the opening week, and he was taken out, and former first-rounder Jack Thompson gets a chance to shine. Also, Anderson was having some injury issues, and the Niners eventually make it 14-3 after a touchdown to Clark, and that's how it stays at halftime. The third quarter saw the Bengals unable to get into field goal range despite some false hope. Thompson wasn't doing much better against the secondary. The score remained the same going into the final quarter. And the Niners' defense was just too damn good. The Bengals had no answer. Montana plunged in from a yard out to wrap up the scoring and lead his team to a 21-3 win, breaking the hearts of Bengals fans. And while the Steelers lost their game that day, they still weren't out of it by any means. It was a disaster of a day for Ken Anderson as Montana, while not playing the best game of his year, got the job done for the Niners. Pete Johnson did have 86 yards for the Bengals, but the Niners secondary snagged 3 interceptions. Lott, Wright, and Turner all doing their thing once each. The Niners finished the season strong. First with a win over Houston 28-6, Montana again steering the ship quite well. Also, Hacksaw and Turner held Earl Campbell just 45 yards rushing. And Montana saw limited playing time, as did many others in the final game of the season, a 21-17 win over the Saints. The Niners finished with their best record in franchise history, 13-3, ending the year with a 5-game winning streak. The Bengals' crushing loss to the Niners had ended their 5-game winning streak, and as luck would have it, however, they would face the only team who was a threat to their playoff spot in winning the division, and that would be the Pittsburgh Steelers. However, if they win here, it's a seal of a deal. They're going to the playoffs if they can pull this off. And they did just that. A big 17-10 win over the Steelers, and the Bengals for the first time since 1975 are going to the playoffs. And for the first time since 1973 have won the division. Collinsworth's rookie year continued to be a glorious one. 90 yards on 8 catches for the win. And the defense held Franco Harris to just 42 yards rushing. How sweet it must have been to do it to the team that has dominated their division and humiliated them for the better part of a decade. And Collinsworth capped off his great rookie year with 128 yards on 5 catches, including a 74-yard touchdown and a thrilling 30-28 win over the Falcons to end the season as the Bengals finish a monster 12-4. The Niners improved all across the board. Their offense was ranked 13th in 1980, this year's 7. Not bad at all. Joe Montana proved he can lead on offense and take command. But the big surprise was the improvement on defense. The drafting of Ronnie Lott, plus a huge year from Hicks, as well as the rest of the secondary, and the offseason signing of Hacksaw Reynolds, as well as the big acquisition of Fred Dean early in the season from the San Diego Chargers. They made this Niners defense one to behold. Bill Walsh had a lot of faith in defensive coordinator Chuck Studley, and he was hired in 1979, and it paid off. Literally from the 3rd worst in the league to 2nd best, only behind the Eagles. As for the Bengals, this was huge as well. On defense, they were about the same as last year, up 2 spots from 14 to a respectable 12th in the league, thanks in large part due to their secondary doing their thing. And hey, the defensive line and linebacker core was also throwing the opposition for a loop. Ken Anderson still showed that he had a lot to give, and he had an incredible year. He finally had a top-notch receiving core to work with, and the drafting of Chris Collinsworth is what put it over the top, along with Dan Ross having an incredible season, not to mention a top-notch running game led by Pete Johnson. Offensive coordinator Lindy Infant, who was promoted to the position just this season, really took on a whole new approach to the game and improves his team all across the board. Literally from the 2nd worst offenses in the league to the 3rd best. Just insane the turnaround these teams have made. Both of these QB's futures were in serious doubt before the start of the season, and now look, in terms of passing yards, both men threw for over 3,500, both men finishing in the top 10, Anderson 5th and Montana in 8th. Montana's 19 touchdown passes were good. It did make the top 10, but he only threw 12 picks all year, while Anderson only threw 10 interceptions all year compared to 13 the year prior, and after a year of only 6 touchdown passes at a career high, 29. Good enough for 3rd behind Bartkowski and Fouts. For completions, they were neck and neck, 311 for Montana and 300 for Anderson, 4th and 5th respectively. As for completion percentage, it was a dead heat. Montana finished 1.1% ahead of Anderson in 2nd. And again, Big Joe led the league. Montana had a great 88.4 passer rating, finishing 4th, but Anderson led the league, a huge career high, 98.4. This is insane. And this is the third time in his career he has led in that category, and the first time since 1975. And what about the guys they threw to? Dwight Clark had his first 1,000-yard receiving season. His 1,105 yards was good enough for 9th in the league. His 85 receptions, however, was 2nd in the league, only about 3 behind Chargers star Kellen Winslow. Freddie Solomon had a huge career year, just 31 yards shy of 1,000. His 8 TDs were tied for 8th among receivers. As for the Bengals, rookie Chris Collinsworth was outstanding with over 1,000 yards. Was also tied for 8th with 8 touchdowns. And Dan Ross, in his 3rd season, had a breakout year with 910 yards receiving, and to boot was tied for 7th in the league with 71 receptions. In terms of running, the Bengals dominated the category out of the two. Pete Johnson had his first 1,000-yard rushing season, averaged nearly 4 yards a carry, and was tied for 5th in the league with 12 rushing touchdowns. Ricky Patton, however, should not be slept on and still came up big for the Niners in many short yardage plays, had over 500 yards and averaged more than 3.5 yards per carry. The offensive line deserves their recognition. Randy Cross helped give Montana a great deal of protection. The team gave up the 6th least amount of sacks in the league, while Anthony Munoz was key in saving Anderson from a lot of punishment, as well as Johnson's 1,000-yard season. The Niners' vastly improved defense was in big part to the acquisition of Fred Dean, whose 13 sacks, the still unofficial stat at the time, was 3rd best in the league. And the big free agent deal for Hacksaw Reynolds and the emergence of sophomore Keena Turner were also key. They were 12th against the run and had the 13th most sacks. As for the Bengals, Reggie Williams had a huge year with 11 sacks, tied for 8th best, whereas Eddie Edwards was key on the pass rush, and veteran linebacker Jim LeClaire was instrumental against the run. The Bengals were 9th best against the run, and also 9th best with the most sacks in the league. That Niners secondary, however, was just crazy good, as Dwight Hicks was tied for 3rd best in the league with 9 interceptions, and first-round draft pick Ronnie Lott proved to be a win. Not only were his 7 picks tied for 7th best, but his 3 touchdown returns off those interceptions led the league and set a record for rookies. Overall, the Niners had 27 interceptions for 5th best in the league and gave up the 3rd least passing yards. As for the Bengals, however, they gave up the 7th most passing yards in the league, but Ken Riley and Louis Breeden optically came up big, and the former, of course, 13-season vet with 2 second-team All-Pro selections, they still had a respectable 19 interceptions as a whole. And of course, let's give our shout-out to the men of the foot. Ray Wersching missed 4 games, hence finishing with under 100 points this season, and still had 81, but was still 5th in the league with 73.9 field goal percentage. Jim Breach's 115 points was good enough for 3rd in the league, behind Raphael Septien and Eddie Murray, who were tied for 1st. But his field goal percentage was under 70, below the top 10. As for punters, Niners' Jim Miller in his sophomore season had a pretty good 41.5 yards per punt. Meanwhile, Pat McNally averaged nearly 45.5 yards a punt. That was best in the entire NFL. In terms of Pro Bowl selections, neither team had any last year. Well, that changed. The Niners had 6 this year. Montana, Clark, Cross, Dean, Lott, and Hicks. 5 of the 6 playing in their first, whereas Dean is making his 3rd straight, but first as a Niner. With the exception of Clark, the other 5 all made year-end All-Pro teams. The Bengals have a very impressive 5 headed to the Pro Bowl: Anderson, Johnson, Collinsworth, Munoz, and McNally, but no defensive selections. Despite that, it's the first for all but Anderson in his 3rd, and his first, however, since 1976. Anderson, Munoz, and McNally were actually all first-team pros. Now let's look at the year-end awards for the regular season. You have to think Walsh and Gregg would have to be Coach of the Year candidates and the front runners in that regard, right? Well, indeed you are right, and Walsh would get the award, dominating the voting. Some felt Gregg was shortchanged in votes, but not to say Walsh didn't deserve it, but I see the Niners were a much more far-gone franchise than the Bengals, so that's why I kind of understand why Walsh got the big turnaround win. But Gregg was still in the running, coming in 2nd. Ronnie Lott came up short for Defensive Rookie of the Year, coming in 2nd to Lawrence Taylor, who had a phenomenal season. Despite this, however, Lott's impact on the Niners was significant. Chris Collinsworth finished 2nd in Offensive Rookie of the Year voting, but the voting was dominated by Saints sensation George Rodgers, and to be fair, he led the NFL in rushing, so that was kind of a given. For Defensive Player of the Year, it was a very tight vote all around. Lawrence Taylor won this award just by 2 votes over Joe Klecko of the Jets. Fred Dean, however, came in 5th with 9 votes, just behind Mark Gastineau and Randy White, who were tied with 10. Coming in 6th with 6 votes was Ronnie Lott. So far, neither team has gotten any awards, but they're getting a lot of votes, it seems, and the key ones. That changed. Ken Anderson was named Offensive Player of the Year, winning a large portion of the vote. His redemption and comeback story is rewarded in kind. Meanwhile, Joe Montana came in third in voting behind Tony Dorsett. And Anthony Munoz came in 10th, registering a vote. An offensive lineman got a vote for Offensive Player of the Year. It showed what an impact he was making. And now the biggie. MVP, Most Valuable Player. And it goes to... Yes, indeed. Ken Anderson, the man who even fans in Cincy were about to give up on, was named the league's most valuable player. What a success story. Montana actually came in second, also showing his success story had a great deal of merit. And Tony Dorsett comes in third in the voting for this as well. And yes, well, there you have it. Ken Anderson, a true Cinderella story this year. And to top it off, Fred Dean got 2 votes, and Ronnie Lott got 1. And if that wasn't enough for Anderson, he was also awarded Pro Football Weekly's Comeback Player of the Year. So now it's playoff time. The biggest test to date. Playoff format back then was the 3 division champs all play in the second round, while the 2 wildcard teams in each conference play in the first to get that final spot for the second round. So for the divisional round, the Niners in their first playoff game since 1972 will play host to the New York Giants, who themselves are making their first playoff appearance since 1963, coming off an upset win over the defending NFC champion Eagles. This was all built on the back of their first round draft pick Lawrence Taylor, a linebacker who I've covered on this channel. LT along with Harry Carson made one of the most dangerous linebacking cores in the league. Also, lineman George Martin was a key attribute. And their defensive backcourt, however, wasn't the strongest, and that's where the Niners need to capitalize. Their offense was decent, with quarterback Scott Runner playing in place of the often injured Phil Simms, but the Niners' defense could take them apart. Joe Montana played as smart a game as anyone could play, throwing for over 300 yards and confusing the Giants' secondary, as Clark and Solomon each had 100 yards receiving. Montana was sacked 3 times, but he shook it off. And Ronnie Lott was brilliant with 2 interceptions in the game, returning them for 72 total yards. Despite the game being tied 7-7 early, the Giants never held the lead. The Niners were never in any danger. A huge 38-24 win for the first time since 1971. The Niners are going to play for the NFC Championship. The Bengals in their first playoff game since 1975 are tasked with facing the Buffalo Bills, who beat the Jets in a wild card playoff and are looking to be a team on the rise in their own right. Veteran QB Joe Ferguson led the way, with Pro Bowl running back Joe Cribbs, who had over 1,000 yards, being a huge weapon, and so is receiver Frank Lewis, who is tied for third in the NFL in receiving. Reggie McKenzie and Conrad Dobler led the offensive line. The Bills also had a strong defense, led by Fred Smerlas, Ben Williams, and former Bengal Sherman White. They have proven to be a nightmare for QBs all season. 6-time Pro Bowler Isaiah Robertson leads the linebacking core, and their secondary wasn't this season either, as they could give Anderson a long night. And it looked good early on. The Bengals jumped out to a 14-0 lead in the first quarter after a good punt return helped Anderson just need 6 plays to lead Charles Alexander to a 4-yard TD run. And on Buffalo's next drive, Ken Riley intercepted the ball, and eventually Johnson plunged in from a yard out, and it stayed 14-0 after a quarter. The Bengals, however, looked poised to make it a 3-touchdown game, but after a turnover and then a 4-yard completion setting up Cribbs running out from a yard out, put Buffalo in the game 14-7, trailing. In the third quarter, Cribbs stunned the Bengals' defense with a 44-yard touchdown run, and the game was suddenly tied. However, after a 20-yard run by Alexander, the Bengals led 21-14 with just 1 quarter to go. The Bills tied, however, early in the fourth with a 21-yard pass from Ferguson to Butler. It's 21-21. And then with 10:39 to play, Anderson found Collinsworth from 16 yards out. The Bengals lead 28-21. The Bills took a careless penalty that cost them dearly on the next drive and turned the ball over on downs. With under a minute to play, Ferguson threw 4 straight incompletions, and Riverfront Stadium roared on the fourth. The Cincinnati Bengals win their first playoff game ever and are headed to the AFC Championship in a 28-21 win over the Bills. Anderson didn't play a monster game, but he played enough to get the win. So now the NFC Championship. The Niners can make it to their first Super Bowl ever and their first appearance in any major championship game. Standing in their way, however, was the Dallas Cowboys, who crushed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Cowboys are hoping to return to the Super Bowl after a 2-season absence. They won in 77 but lost in 78. But they have the tools to do it. Staubach may be gone, but Danny White was filling the void quite well at quarterback. Tony Dorsett was one of the best running backs in the league. His 5th straight 1,000-yard season and a career high 1,646 on the ground. He had star receivers Tony Hill and Drew Pearson. Tight end Billy Joe Dupree. An offensive line led by Pat Donovan and Herbert Scott. A superstar defensive line had Too Tall Jones, Harvey Martin, and the great Randy White. Dangerous linebacking core led by Bob Bruning, while Everson Walls and Charlie Waters, easy for me to say, led the secondary. This team was full of Pro Bowl players, many left from their championship team from Super Bowl 12. If any team can take this Niners club down, it's the Cowboys. And yep, things look good early on. After the Niners forced Dallas to punt, Montana went to work. 2 long yardage completions led to an 8-yard TD pass to Solomon's 7-0 Niners. But things fell apart quick after the Cowboys cut the gap with a field goal. And then Bill Ring fumbled, and then White hit Tony Hill from 26 yards out, 10-7 Cowboys after 1. Montana threw what could have been a costly pick in the second quarter, but the Niners defense held him in there, and they made up for his folly. A 20-yard pass to Dwight Clark to give the Niners the lead back 14-10. After a questionable pass interference call on Lott negated an interception, Dorsett would later score on a 5-yard touchdown pass to get Dallas a 17-14 lead. Turnover problems continued for the Niners as they would this whole game. Montana fumbled late in the half, and the Cowboys carried that 3-point lead into the half. Montana had a chance to get the Niners back in it, but another turnover, this one an interception. But then Danny Leopold intercepted the Danny White pass, setting up a 2-yard run from Johnny Davis, making it 21-17 for the Niners. The Cowboys early in the fourth, however, closed the gap to a point. And then they had another turnover, this time a fumble, allowed Dallas to score again. It's 27-21. This is not looking good. With 4:54 to play and getting the ball on their own 11, it's time for Montana to prove he's a winner. Freddie Solomon had 2 catches for 18 yards and ran 15 on a receiver reverse. But then they found themselves on the Dallas 6, and it was 3rd and 3. Across the offensive line and made sure to give Montana the block he needed. He saw Clark breaking away from Walls in the end zone. He threw a very high pass, and like a superhero, Clark soared in the air, reached with all his might, and caught it, and pulled it in as Candlestick Park shook to its foundation in a play forever known simply as the catch. A truly epic moment that the city of San Francisco, even people who don't really love sports necessarily, has never forgotten. And to this day is one of the most replayed moments in NFL history, and is considered to be arguably the biggest moment in Niners history. What some people forget is that the Niners got a bit of a scare after that. It looked as if after a catch by Pearson, he was gone for a touchdown, but Eric Wright made a huge tackle, was a hero for the Niners as well. He barely made it. White would then fumble after a sack by Pillars, which was recovered by Stuckey, and the San Francisco 49ers are going to the Super Bowl. And hey, let's go back to Cincinnati, the AFC Championship. It's the Bengals hosting the best offensive powerhouse in the league, the San Diego Chargers. The Chargers had arguably the best QB in the game at the time, Dan Fouts, the most talented and dangerous receiving core in the NFL, Charlie Joyner, Kellen Winslow, and Wes Chandler. Hell, this might be the best receiving core in just terms of pure talent in NFL history. They had a 1,000-yard rusher, Chuck Muncie, and the superb offensive line led by Russ Washington, Ed White, and Doug Wilkerson. Despite the loss of Dean, however, the Chargers still had a solid defensive line, still the best part of their defense, with Gary Johnson and Louis Kelcher. But the rest of the defense was simply passable and not always consistent. But that's the strange thing is defensive backs Glenn Edwards, Willie Buchanan, and Allen Ellis had all success on other teams. They weren't gelling all that well together and had the worst passing defense in the NFL. This is where Anderson can take them apart if he really wants to. They were coming off an epic OT win in a 41-38 victory over the Dolphins in the divisional round. It was a game deemed as the Freezer Bowl due to its minus 23 degrees Celsius temperature, and that didn't include the wind chill factor for that matter. And the Bengals defense took apart Fouts and company, causing him to throw 13 incompletions, 2 interceptions as Winslow and Joyner, yes, the former Bengal, were contained to under 50 yards receiving as Fouts only had 185 yards passing, and with no defense, it just wasn't going to be enough. The Bengals defense was on point. Eddie Edwards was all over Fouts, as was Bo Harris. Bobby Kemp and Louis Breeden each had interceptions, and it was mostly a defensive game, as Anderson didn't need to put up big numbers, but made some big plays, but again, didn't really need to. The Chargers defense just had nothing going for them, while Johnson had 80 yards rushing. The Cincinnati Bengals made this cold, unforgiving day for the Chargers all that much more colder. A 27-7 win. The Cincinnati Bengals are going to the Super Bowl. And now here we are, Once again, where this story started, back at January 24th, 1982, the Pontiac Silverdome in Detroit, Super Bowl 16. The Cincinnati Bengals in the mid-1970s were on the cusp of something special, but a few questionable decisions made for the team to fall quickly. The San Francisco 49ers had become one of the biggest laughingstocks in the NFL with their constant failure, bad management, but one man, Bill Walsh, had a vision and turned it all around, seemingly at the drop of a dime. Two teams who weren't even supposed to make the playoffs, let alone the Super Bowl, are here. And while there are many subplots to this story, one stands out the most: the quarterbacks. Joe Montana, deemed not good enough by the NFL, started as a backup, and nobody believed he'd be a leading man, so to speak. He proved the world wrong. Ken Anderson, he has been a star, has won numerous accolades, but fell off the radar. With a strong receiving core, finally he was named MVP. He proved the world wrong. And now they and their teammates have the chance of a lifetime. Here we go. Over 81,000 fans at the Pontiac Silverdome for what has to be the most unexpected Super Bowl matchup of all time at this point. It looked good for the Bengals early on as the Niners fumbled the opening kickoff, and Anderson, after a few plays, got them down to the 5-yard line. However, an incomplete pass and a sack brought up third down. After looking for Curtis in the end zone, Hicks intercepted the pass, returning it to the 32-yard line. The Niners took over. A big play call followed, a reverse flea flicker that involved Solomon that allowed him to make a 14-yard completion to the 33, too young. And after 3 running plays and then another 14-yard completion, this one was Solomon, Montana was able to sneak the ball in from 1 yard out. The Niners strike first at 7-0 after the first quarter. The Bengals didn't seem phased, however, as they were driving, and Anderson was in full command of this ship. From the San Fran 24, Anderson hit Collinsworth with a beautiful 19-yard pass at the 5, but Wright shook the ball loose. The Niners recovered. It wasn't looking good at all for the Bengals. The Niners then drove what was then a Super Bowl record, 92 yards at Montana, making the littlest and biggest plays matter, made it all the way to the Bengals 10 and hit Earl Cooper in the end zone. The Niners now lead 14-0, and who could forget Cooper's famous spike of the ball. The Bengals needed to desperately get back into this thing, as now 2 turnovers have cost them dearly. Walsh's strategies, however, were working immensely, as now what is dubbed as a squib kick from Wershing buried the Bengals at their own 2. The Bengals didn't get far, and they punted the ball away. Montana getting firm control, 3 completions to Clark, one of which was for 17 yards, and some nice short runs from Patton led to Wershing hitting a 22-yard field goal, 17-0. And then another squib kick was mishandled by Griffin and led to a turnover. And with time ticking down in the half, the Niners had the ball again. Another field goal, 20-0. This is the largest halftime lead at this point in the history of the Super Bowl, and the Bengals were being written off already. This game was pretty much as good as over, or so it seemed. Cincinnati, however, didn't look rattled as Greg had the team remaining focused. Also, Anderson had taken a beating from the likes of Fred Dean and Hacksaw Reynolds. He wasn't playing bad, but the Niners just seemed to have his number, and they just seemed to have their Bengals number in every facet of the game. They received the opening kickoff, and Anderson started on his own 17, and momentum picked up. When Alexander made a 13-yard run, plus a face masking penalty gave them more yardage. Anderson made some smart passes, just simply moving the sticks and not taking huge risks at this point. However, on 3rd and 4, he would change that and completed a 19-yard pass to Steve Crater, and then later completed the 9-play, 83-yard drive, killing some good time off the clock to boot with a 5-yard run from Alexander for the big touchdown, and the deficit was cut to 20-7. Since he's not out of this thing yet. The Cincinnati defense then stunned the Niners as Montana couldn't move the ball at all, almost literally. And later in the quarter, the Bengals looked to have another chance. After a good punt return, they had the ball in midfield, but despite another sack and penalties bearing them back to the 37-yard line, they remained focused. So focused that Anderson made a monster play. The biggest play for Cincinnati so far in this game, a 49-yard pass to Collinsworth, putting them all the way to the Niners' 14. The Bengals had moved the ball a bit, and the Niners defense ever stood strong, and they forced a 4th down. Rather than go for a field goal, however, Greg opted to go for it. It was a huge risk, but at this point they need it. Pete Johnson made a nice plunge to the 3-yard line, giving the Bengals 1st down and a fresh set of downs. The Bengals then made it to the 1, but then, however, after losing a yard on a 2nd down due to a blocking miscue, the Bengals were on 3rd down. Anderson then faked to Johnson, and then completing a swing pass to Alexander near the line of scrimmage, but Dan Buns wrapped him up, making a huge play forcing fourth down. Nobody could believe it. Everyone was in shock. The commentators, the fans, they thought since he had those touchdown for sure. You heard of the catch. That was the stop. And again, the Bengals opted to go for it. Johnson again got the ball, but then a trifecta tackle. Buns, Lott, and Hacksaw stop the Bengals from scoring. The ball is turned over, and it remains 20-7 after 3. The Niners, however, still couldn't move the ball. For whatever reason, Montana was stuck in the mud, and the Bengals secondary was all over Clark, not letting him get open. Any other team might have accepted defeat after losing a goal line stand like that, but not the Bengals. They marched the ball 53 yards, and Anderson, who was making some great plays, found Ross in the end zone, 4 yards out. Oh boy. And they cut the gap to 2014 with still 10 minutes to play. This game just became a whole new one. But the Niners need to get the ball moving. Literally. And Montana finally does just that. He does what he is so expertly do for the next 13 years going forward and use the clock to his advantage, taking 4:41 off the clock in a 9-play drive, which included 7 straight running plays and a 22-yard completion to Mike Wilson, as Clark had pretty much been taken out of the game by the Bengals defense. It set up a 40-yard field goal from Wersching, 23-14 San Fran with 5 minutes to play. Oh boy, this game's getting further out of reach. But on the first play of the next drive, Wright intercepted Anderson's pass and ran it back 25 yards. He would fumble, but the Niners would still recover. They ran the ball 5 times, killing 3 minutes. The Niners added yet another field goal, 26-14, less than 2 minutes to play. But the Bengals were not quitters, and Anderson would not allow this team to quit. Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 straight completions on the 6th. 3 yards in the end zone to Ross with 60 seconds to play. But the Bengals, however, had trouble stopping the clock on this drive. That's why they lost so much time. They couldn't get out of bounds with any of their catches. Now, with bated breath as they prepare an onside kick, trailing 26-21. Bengals fans waited anxiously. So were San Francisco fans. This is the game right here. A simple kick, or so it seems. The kick bounces. It makes the yardage it needs to. Clark grabs it. The San Francisco 49ers, Super Bowl champions. A true Cinderella story for the ages. Oh, sure, by the time the game happened, nobody was surprised the Niners won. They were 13-3 for God's sake. But in September, as week 1 commenced, I'm willing to bet that even their own fans didn't have that much faith. The game was a roller coaster ride. At the end of the day, we can give praise to every single player in uniform that day, especially on the defense. But really what it came down to, and I think many agree this is the case, was Walsh, the man that Cincinnati passed up for a head coaching job, outcoached Forrest Gregg. Ah yes, a team that was once a punchline on this night began the road to being the NFL's biggest dynasty of the 1980s. Joe Montana was Super Bowl MVP, 14 for 22, 157 yards and a touchdown. Some have argued this was undeserving and it should have gone to a member of the San Fran defense. Many argued for Wright as he played a huge game. Fred Dean, Hacksaw, and especially Dan Buns were also talked about, as Buns was MVP on that goal line stop alone. And not to mention the Bengals were held on just 72 yards rushing. But much like Plunkett the year before, I could see why Montana was chosen, even if he should maybe not have been the top choice. His stats may not look all that outstanding, but his focus on controlling of the game and the offense are what would make him a great QB on this night and in the future the rest of his great career. He did have a huge first half, however, and that's where most of his stats came from. Yes, he was shut down in the third quarter, and the fourth the Niners just kept running the ball, but again, that was all part of the strategy, which he led. So his leadership is likely what won him the award. He may not have been my choice after watching this game back, but it's certainly still an understandable one. Ken Anderson has nothing to be ashamed of. He played a beauty of a game, despite some costly picks, only threw 9 incompletions, and the Bengals never quit. Even when a win seemed almost impossible, they made it seem like it was somewhat possible, even towards the end. He had 300 yards. He was not well protected, however, since his blocking just seemed all over the place. Even Munoz was off his game. Sadly, however, this was Anderson's only shot at a championship in his career. Collinsworth and Ross both had over 100 yards receiving, as they made some big plays too, but that fumble from Collinsworth has not been forgotten. Stories like this are what legends are made of, and indeed Hall of Famers on both sides have been honored. Joe Montana and Ronnie Lott were both inducted in the same year, their first year of eligibility in 2000. whereas Fred Dean had to wait a long time for his enshrinement, but eventually got it in 2008. Bill Walsh was inducted back in 1993, while owner Edward D. Bartello Jr., whose purchase of this team was the first step in getting the team to prominence, was inducted in 2016. The only member of the Bengals to be inducted, however, was offensive lineman Anthony Munoz, who went on to become one of the best in the game. He too was inducted in his first year of eligibility. That was 1998. However, some arguments are still being made for other players in these two teams. Ken Anderson is one that comes up a lot. He did play 16 seasons and is a former MVP, a 4-time Pro Bowler, and led the league in passer rating 4 times. Many say what's keeping him out is the fact that he, doesn't have a Super Bowl, only ever played in one, and has only 2 All-Team Pro selections. In my opinion, he should be in. Also, someone I see Bengals fans arguing for on social media still is Chris Collinsworth. He has come up. I can see kind of both sides on this one. His career was short, only 8 seasons, but that's not really the reason why. Indeed, for a time, he was the best. He had 4 1,000-yard seasons, was just 11 shy of 1,000 for another year, and had 708 games during that strike-shortened season in 1982. For 6 years, he was probably the most talented receiver in the league, arguably, but with just 3 Pro Bowl selections and 3 All-Team Pro selections, which is still really good, it don't seem enough compared to some others. Also, Dwight Clark has come up quite often too, and I can see why he's not in, however. His career, like Collinsworth's, was short, but yes, we see people with short careers get inducted often, but they're usually dominant in their short time. For example, running back Terrell Davis. Clark only had one 1,000-yard season, but he had 2 more with 900, and 2 others with just above 800, and only had 2 Pro Bowls and 1 All-Pro selection, and yes, he was key in the 2 Super Bowl wins for the Niners. But many Niners fans, their argument actually just used the catch. Yes, it may have been one of the most famous plays in the history of the game, but at the same time, one play does not make you a Hall of Famer. Yeah, sure, it'll etch your legacy, but it doesn't make you a Hall of Famer. Yes, New York Islanders fans still think Bob Nystrom's a god, and very well so. He was a great clutch player who scored the most important goal in New York Islanders history, but again, that does not make him a Hall of Famer. And finally, Dwight Hicks, the star defensive back. Niners fans, they argue for him quite often. He does have 4 Pro Bowls and 2 Super Bowls, and was actually grossly underrated for his time, and was very talented and could cover the most talented receivers very well and very accurately. But he had only 1 All-Team Pro selection, really doesn't warrant a valid argument too much, but Niners fans still vouch for him. Out of these 4, I'd say Anderson is the only one I feel that deserves enshrinement. There are others I'll talk about in the future, like Hacksaw Reynolds, but that's more when I'll cover his career with the Rams. Well, indeed, that does it for our look at the Niners and Bengals' unlikely journey to the big game, Super Bowl 16. Please like the video, share, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'll see ya!